Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. No matter what time zone you're sipping in, welcome back to Sip&Talk.
Welcome, everyone. Glad to be back.
The weather's finally turning crisp, and you know what that means for me. It is winter stockpiling season.
Oh, boy.
Last weekend, I went to the grocery store and bought, enough instant ramen and canned goods to last me through an apocalypse. And then right at the checkout, I saw this ad for a mukbang challenge.
Hold on. I think you might be getting a little off track already.
Yeah.
Our Sip&Talkers are probably not here for your grocery adventures.
I promise. I have a point. Okay, fine. The point is, last time we did a deep dive on that balloon secession thing, and the reaction, especially from our listeners in Taiwan, was, well, it was fantastic.
Yeah, we got a lot of great feedback on that one.
And they want us to keep unpacking the messaging that comes out of Beijing. Specifically, they pointed out how often the CCP foreign ministry boasts about China's massive GDP total being higher than Taiwan's. They use it as, proof that they are richer.
And it's so crucial to listen closely to the specific terminology they use there. There's always a detail that is never missing, and it's that they talk about GDP total.
Exactly. That's the core of the issue for me. It's the classic problem of, comparing the total bread of the entire school to the total stomach capacity of just one class.
Right.
It sounds like a victory because the total number is bigger, but the comparison itself just feels fundamentally weird,
Let me make that even clearer with your analogy. Imagine you have a class full of exceptionally successful, high-earning people, the big eaters, as you put it, and they can each afford 5 loaves of bread.
Okay.
Then you take the total bread supply for an average school where most people only get 1 loaf, and you stand up and boast, look, our school can consume more bread than that one class of big eaters. That boast completely misses the point of individual affluence.
That weird logic requires a serious reality check. But today, we're going far beyond just the bread analogy. We're going to trace China's story from its early U.S.-aided economic takeoff through the whole Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure boom.
And we'll question whether severe pollution is just the inevitable cost of industry.
Right. And we'll examine the structural headwinds they face today and whether their international display of great power style can realistically be sustained through 2026. We need to look at the data versus the reality and figure out who is bearing the true costs.
Today, we are really undertaking a critical deep dive into the numbers, and more importantly, the narrative around those numbers.
That's why we've titled this deep dive, From Openness Boom to Reversal, China's 2026 Illusory Glory.
Okay, so let's unpack this core question right away, this whole GDP illusion. It feels like the central contradiction in this geopolitical information war.
It really is.
China says, look how big our pile of bread is. And the counterargument is, yeah, but how much bread does the average person actually get to eat? We have to separate what some call the national face, the total muscle the state can flex, from the individual lining, the actual standard of living available to the average citizen.
So when Beijing boasts, they're all about the GDP total.
Always. It's projected to crest over, $18.5 trillion in 2024. That is globally the second largest economy. That kind of economic scale just commands attention.
And the argument they make for why that staggering total size matters is, frankly, pretty compelling if you're looking at it from a state-level global influence perspective. I mean, they aren't wrong that size itself grants power.
They absolutely are not. That scale translates directly into massive international influence. Just consider this fact. China is the world's largest trading nation.
Right.
Its sheer economic health and capacity are absolutely critical for global commodity prices, for supply chain stability, for global demand. I mean, if you're talking geopolitics, trade negotiations, or leveraging power in organizations like the UN, the WTO, the IMF, total GDP is your primary bargaining chip.
It lets them shape the rules of the game.
Exactly. It allows them to shape global financial regulations and trade flows.
And that comes back to the analogy we started with. The total wealth determines the magnitude of what a nation can do collectively.
Yes. A massive total GDP is what allows a state to pull off these huge, massive projects, like a cutting-edge space program, deploying a massive military, or building 28,000 miles of high-speed rail.
You just can't do that with a small, wealthy nation's budget.
You can't. You can't achieve that level of national infrastructure or global military projection by pooling the resources of a smaller country, no matter how rich its citizens are individually.
Okay, so that's the key distinction. Total GDP is about the state's potential. But now let's look at the other side of the coin, the Taiwan argument, which focuses on GDP per capita.
Right, or what we could call individual economic health. This is what measures the daily reality of affluence for the average person.
And this is where the figures stop being so staggering for China and, well, they start to sink a little. China's projected nominal GDP per capita for 2024 is estimated to be around $13,100.
Now, compare that to Taiwan. Taiwan's projected GDP per capita for the same year is significantly higher, around $35,000.
Yeah.
I mean, that's according to projections from the IMF and World Bank.
Wow.
You are looking at nearly 2.7 times the individual wealth for the average person. The contrast is just stark.
That gap is enormous. It's the difference between bragging about the size of the national granary and asking if the average family has enough food in their pantry.
And per capita is the universally accepted, the standard economic metric for measuring actual standard of living. It's about purchasing power, welfare, material comfort. The true indicator of affluence.
So this is how we decide if a country is developed or not.
It's the primary benchmark. If you look at international standards, for instance, major publications like The Economist often use a $30,000 per capita threshold as the baseline to classify a country as a developed economy.
And Taiwan is well past that.
Comfortably. They've crossed and maintained that threshold. China, despite its massive total size, remains firmly classified as a high middle-income country. They have the collective scale, but not the individual affluence.
And this leads directly to the core problem, which is the massive wealth distribution issue inside China. That huge GDP total gets so severely diluted by a population of 1.4 billion people.
And it's compounded by these extreme internal disparities. The economic engine is massive, sure, but the power it generates is spread incredibly thin. The result is just massive inequality.
Do we have data on that inequality?
We do, and it's troubling. Economists use the Gini coefficient to measure income inequality, where a figure above 0.4 is often cited as the international warning line for severe disparity.
And China's is.
It has consistently hovered above that 0.4 mark. The wealth is highly concentrated in a small, affluent coastal elite, and the historical urban-rural income gap is still huge. Vast swaths of the population are just not benefiting proportionally from that $18.5 trillion total.
It's like the difference between a $1 trillion company being divided among 100,000 employees, giving everyone a great salary and pension, versus that same $1 trillion being concentrated among just 10 executives. The individual feeling of affluence for the majority is just vastly different. The dilution effect is undeniable.
Now, we should probably address a common counter-argument that Beijing often uses, which is purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Right, PPP.
Yeah.
This is an attempt to adjust the numbers to account for the local cost of living, right?
Exactly. The theory is, if things are cheaper in China, your $13,100 goes further.
Yeah.
For example, if a meal costs $5 in Beijing but $15 in Taipei, the PPP adjustment boosts China's number because their dollar buys more local stuff.
Okay, so what does that adjustment do to the numbers?
It helps, for sure. When you adjust for PPP, China's per capita GDP looks better. It sits around $23,000.
That's a definite improvement over $13,100. It closes the gap a bit.
It does. But when you apply the same PPP metric to Taiwan, their PPP per capita is still around $70,000.
Yeah. Wow. So even adjusting for the cost of living, the gap is still massive.
Absolutely. The individual purchasing power and overall wealth of the average person in Taiwan remains orders of magnitude higher. The gap persists, whichever metric you use.
So let's wrap the segment with that kind of philosophical takeaway. In your view, is wealthy defined by a nation building the longest high-speed rail lines, which is a collective state benefit, or is it defined by the average citizen being able to afford their own home?
That is the crux of the comparison contradiction. The CCP strategically uses the national total figure for political messaging, for this projection of state superiority.
And critics use the individual number.
Exactly. Critics, using standard development metrics, focus on the individual per capita figure to measure life satisfaction. They are deliberately comparing apples of state power with oranges of individual wealth.
So the national face is huge and projected globally, but the people's lining, the average standard of living, remains relatively thin and highly unequal.
And just to put a final pin in this, the latest IMF 2024 forecast confirms Taiwan's per capita GDP remains top tier among developed Asian economies. Economically, the data strongly supports the per capita measure when you're judging the people's wealth. The boast is about scale, not shared prosperity.
That sets the scene perfectly. So we know China has this massive engine, but the individual output is low. Now let's talk about how they even achieved that gigantic total GDP in the first place, and why that success story is now hitting some serious structural headwinds, a fundamental reversal, really.
Right. The initial success story is often framed internally as this national miracle, but it relied so heavily on a golden age of geopolitical easing, specifically the normalization of relations with the U.S.
The opening in 1971.
That was it.
Well,
orchestrated by Kissinger and Nixon, it immediately relieved this tremendous geopolitical strain. At one point, the U.S. even warned the USSR against attacking China.
That opening was the gateway. It gave them political stability and, more importantly, the economic ticket to integrate into Western markets during that superglobalization era.
And that's what quickly transformed them into the world factory.
I mean, think about what that provided. Unfettered access to Western capital, cutting-edge technology transfer, and, critically, the demand from massive, wealthy Western markets.
That influx of technology and demand fueled the entire boom for 3 decades.
But that golden age of easy access is now, as you said, in a severe structural reversal.
It is. China is now systematically losing access to those rich country markets, to key high technology, especially semiconductors and foreign capital investment, is either fleeing or being heavily scrutinized.
You've got the U.S. trade and tech wars.
And it's not just the U.S. The EU and Japan are following suit with various de-risking strategies and new tariffs. The whole environment has changed.
So what does the security environment feel like now compared to the 70s?
It is dramatically more challenging and far more dangerous. Instead of easing, China is now facing what geopolitical analysts are calling comprehensive containment.
So it's not just trade barriers.
Oh no. We are seeing thousands of new trade and investment barriers, sure. But militarily, the environment is constrained by the rapid expansion of U.S. military bases and alliances all throughout the Indo-Pacific. The cooperative, globalized environment that let China rise is now actively working to contain it. That's reversal number 1. Geopolitical containment.
And reversal number 2 is fascinating because it's internal. The change in governance where economic efficiency is being sacrificed for political power.
This is a huge one. Back in the post-1976 era, local officials were actually rewarded primarily based on verifiable economic performance, not blind loyalty.
And there's an irony there, right? The chaos of the Cultural Revolution kind of unintentionally helped.
It's a major irony. The destruction of central planning during that period unintentionally created these voids that allowed semi-private markets to flourish and grassroots prosperity to bubble up. Efficiency and local economic initiative drove promotions.
But the present stagnation is the result of what some are calling the new dictatorship, a radical centralization of power.
Exactly. Economic flexibility and predictability are now actively sacrificed to ensure political loyalty. I mean, just look at the immediate and profound economic disruption from the unpredictable zero-COVID lockdowns.
Or the suppression of Hong Kong's autonomy.
Which was a huge, reliable financial and legal gateway for the mainland. These are fundamentally political actions that inflict profound economic chilling effects.
And what about the officials on the ground? The anti-corruption campaigns, while maybe necessary in theory, seem to have had this massive side effect of paralysis.
It's created a massive policy chill. Grassroots officials are now terrified of making a mistake that could be seen as disloyal or financially irregular. So a bureaucrat would much rather do nothing than risk taking an innovative action that might lead to political scrutiny.
So innovation just dies.
It suffers, and crucial dynamism is lost. And this is all compounded by the systematic information blackout.
You mean censorship?
Extensive censorship of negative economic news. Like the politically sensitive decision to simply stop releasing youth unemployment figures when they became alarmingly high.
And if you don't have good data, you can't make good policy.
Exactly. It makes it incredibly difficult for central policymakers to correct serious errors during a downturn because they just don't have accurate, unfiltered data.
Okay, so geopolitical access is shrinking, internal governance is throttling efficiency. Now, the third reversal hits the very foundations of the economy. Resource depletion.
And this represents the most severe long-term existential threat to China's growth story. The environmental cost of that massive, unconstrained growth period is coming due.
How bad is it? Give us some of the hard facts on this resource crisis, maybe starting with water.
Okay, water scarcity. Over the past few decades, about half of China's rivers have disappeared entirely.
Half?
Half. Due to diversion, damming, or just drying up. And more critically, 60% of the groundwater across major regions is so severely polluted, it's unsuitable for human contact, let alone agriculture, without heavy treatment.
The scale of that is just hard to grasp.
It's catastrophic in urban centers. As we noted, Beijing's per capita water availability is actually comparable to Saudi Arabia's.
A desert nation.
Think about the logistics and economic complexity of sustaining one of the world's largest capital cities with the water constraints of a desert nation. The costs to secure clean water are immense.
And it's not just water. What about energy and food?
China's rapidly depleted most of its easily accessible oil and gas. Even coal, which they have a lot of, is getting more expensive and complex to extract. And then, decades of intense industrial farming and pollution have rendered nearly half of its arable land unusable.
Due to pollution and desertification.
Right. Which means China has structurally reversed its role in the global supply chain. Historically a net exporter of many things, it is now the world's largest energy and food importer.
They have outsourced their own security.
Precisely. Their massive economy is now incredibly vulnerable to geopolitical shocks, supply chain disruptions, and global price swings.
So what's the cumulative effect of these three headwinds: containment, governance, and resource depletion?
The effect is multiplicative. It means the cost to produce just one single unit of GDP is now 3 times what it was during the boom of the 2000s. The engine isn't just slowing down, it's running on incredibly expensive, high maintenance, and polluting fumes.
That triple cost multiplier, 3 times the resources to generate the same growth, tells us a huge portion of that extra expense is basically environmental debt, or technical debt. Let's look at how China's massive pollution isn't just a domestic crisis, but is systematically exported to its neighbors.
Right, and this has to be viewed through the lens of structural, high-carbon industrial dependency. We need to look at the composition of the pollution based on recent data, like 2025 estimates, to really understand its complexity.
Historically, the image is just huge coal-fired power plants create these giant smog clouds. Is coal still the main driver?
It is still highly significant, yeah. Coal burning, which is not just power generation but also heating, and a key input for steel, cement, and chemical sectors, accounts for between 40 to 50% of the key airborne particulate matter, like PM2.5.
And that's the stuff that causes the terrible winter smog.
That's the source of the severe winter smog in the north, which has been linked to hundreds of thousands of premature deaths in baseline studies. Even as China rolls out clean energy, the sheer volume of coal used in heavy industry just offsets many of those gains.
But the sources also highlight a rapidly rising secondary culprit: mobile sources like cars and trucks.
Yes, and this represents a major governance shift. Mobile sources vehicles, construction machinery, agricultural equipment, shipping now contribute about 30 to 35% of total air pollutants. In 2024, for instance, total mobile source emissions reached nearly 18.6 million tons.
So the problem is getting harder to solve. It's not just controlling a few big factories anymore.
Exactly. You have to control millions of moving vehicles and small machines. The nature of the pollution has shifted from simple, localized coal smoke to a complex, region-wide composite mix of coal, vehicle exhaust-like nitrogen oxides, and secondary pollutants like ozone. This complex mix is much harder to govern.
And this gigantic, complex pollution cloud, it doesn't respect international borders. How does it get exported eastward?
The mechanism is natural, really. It's continental geography.
Yeah.
The bulk of the PM2.5, sulfur dioxide, and NOx emitted from the northern industrial areas gets lifted by the westerlies and cold fronts. These particulates are then carried across the Yellow Sea and the East China Sea.
How long does that take?
They can travel for anywhere between 3 to 14 days before settling down in neighboring countries.
So what are the consequences for nations like South Korea and Japan?
The impact is highly seasonal. It peaks sharply during the winter heating period and the spring. In South Korea, PM2.5 concentrations in cities like Seoul frequently soar past the 150 mark on the air quality index, which is classified as unhealthy.
That's not just an inconvenience, that's a measurable health cost, right?
It is a quantifiable foreign health cost. The pollution significantly contributes to increases in respiratory and heart emergencies. It boosts mortality rates for infants and the elderly by a measurable margin. Some estimates range from a 0.5% to a 4.6% increase, depending on the smog event.
But didn't we see some positive movement on this front? Because of China's own efforts.
Yes, which is important for balance. China's domestic reduction efforts between 2015 and 2019, which cut PM2.5 levels by about 9.6 micrograms per cubic meter, resulted in a quantifiable benefit for its neighbors.
Oh, that's interesting.
Analysts estimate this reduction actually saved South Korea an estimated $2.6 billion annually in medical costs and lost productivity. It shows that cooperation and reduction efforts have a direct cross-border economic payoff.
And even further afield, like Japan and Taiwan.
Smog transmission triggers corresponding peaks in allergic rhinitis and asthma cases in both Japan and Taiwan. And historically, major Gobi dust storms in 2013, which were amplified by pollution, were tracked all the way across the Pacific. They caused noticeable smog events even in California's Owens Valley.
Wow. The whole global air current is a shared liability. Okay, let's pivot to water, because this is where the debate gets really controversial, especially when you compare it to nuclear waste. Our source material makes this powerful claim that the massive scale of untreated chemical and organic wastewater poses a larger and more acute threat than current nuclear plant effluent.
Right, and we need to apply a cold, rational lens here. Untreated industrial and domestic sewage is what I'd call continuous acute poisoning. It is actively, systematically, and continuously destroying entire ecosystems on a vast scale right now.
With immediate effects?
With immediate effects. Regulated nuclear waste discharge, specifically the liquid effluent that primarily contains tritium, is a potential long-term threat. It requires high monitoring, but the sheer volume and toxicity of the continuous chemical pollution just dwarf the immediate impact of regulated nuclear discharge.
So the focus that we often see on nuclear discharge, particularly from governments and media, it might be distracting from a much larger ongoing sewage disaster.
The data is unequivocal on this. Look at the inland river systems. 70% of China's rivers are classified as unfit for human drinking. Even more shocking, 90% of urban groundwater is contaminated with dangerous levels of heavy metals and pollutants.
And the Yangtze River?
The Yangtze, this massive economic artery, receives 40% of China's total wastewater. Historically, up to 80% of that was reported as flowing in untreated.
And that all pours into the Pacific Ocean.
Yes.
Yeah.
China is documented as the largest polluter of the Pacific. We are talking about billions of tons of wastewater annually, 2.8 billion tons into the Bohai Sea, and a staggering 8.3 billion tons near the sensitive Taiwan Strait.
What are the visible ecological consequences of that?
It results in devastating ecological events like extensive red tides or harmful algae blooms, particularly in the East China Sea. Analysis shows that 80% of that sea area is now unsuitable for fishing, causing massive economic losses.
And it affects their neighbors' fisheries, too.
Absolutely. Rivers like the Pearl and Yangtze contribute 40% of the global coastal nitrogen input. This leads directly to eutrophication and marine dead zones that significantly affect fisheries in places like Vietnam and the Philippines, with estimated annual losses over $500 million.
That's a clear economic impact exported through water. Okay, so let's quickly put the nuclear wastewater issue into context just for regulatory scale.
We need to emphasize that nuclear plant liquid discharge, mainly tritium, is a standard global industrial practice. It's strictly regulated by international bodies like the IAEA and domestic regulators like China's own NNSA.
But China's scale is growing so rapidly, which complicates the discussion.
It does. China has 57 operational nuclear plants and is undergoing one of the world's fastest nuclear expansion programs.
Okay.
So while the discharge is routine and regulated, the total aggregated volume is what creates the political vulnerability for them.
So let's put that volume in perspective. What is the proposed annual limit for something like Fukushima's discharge, and what is China's total output?
Okay, so Fukushima's proposed annual limit for tritium discharge is set at 22 terabecquerel, or TBQ. For context, China's total tritium liquid discharge from all its nuclear power plants reached an aggregated 1,246.9 TBQ in 2021.
Wow, that is exponentially higher.
It is. It's much higher than the limits of single plants in neighboring countries or even individual Chinese plants.
So the nuance is clear. While the nuclear discharge itself is routine, the sheer, rapidly expanding volume sets a very high bar for any country that wants to point fingers at others' emissions.
The conclusion stands. The total high volume of routine nuclear discharge creates a potential international controversy for sure, but it should never be confused with the massive, systemic, and far more ecologically damaging scale of untreated chemical and organic wastewater pollution. That acute continuous poisoning is the far greater and more ignored crisis of technical debt.
That environmental debt is huge. Now let's turn to the financial debt. Specifically, the massive projection of Chinese power through the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI. It was initially sold as this glorious vision, right? Over $1 trillion invested globally, thousands of miles of rail and ports. Why is it now being called a debt trap?
Because the glorious gift wrap often concealed a structural financial bomb that was just waiting to detonate. The initial image was shared global benefit. The accelerating reality is unsustainable sovereign debt. We are currently staring down a major imminent financial event, the 2025 debt tidal wave.
A repayment tidal wave? What does that look like in pure numbers?
Okay, so 75 developing countries are bracing for a massive $35 billion repayment peak to China in 2025. And what's truly crippling is that $22 billion of that total is due from the world's poorest nations.
So China has become the world's biggest debt collector.
In a very short time, they've transformed from a development partner into the largest, most aggressive debt collector in the developing world. It's a complete reversal of that initial partner and shared prosperity narrative.
So how did this happen? It wasn't just poor global economics, right? The structure of the debt itself made this crash almost inevitable.
That's right. The crisis was baked into the mechanism. China's loans, often channeled through their policy banks, have significantly higher interest rates than traditional development loans. We're talking 4 to 6% interest, compared to the World Bank's typical 2% or less.
And they have short maturities.
Very short, usually only 5 to 10 years, which makes refinancing and repayment much harder for nations with unstable economies. And on top of that, many of these are essentially hidden debt.
What does that mean, hidden debt?
They are notoriously opaque. Many loans are structured as guaranteed loans or through these special purpose vehicles, which are often kept off the public balance sheet of the borrowing government. This complicates any external analysis and prevents timely intervention from bodies like the IMF.
And the cost is also inflated because they have to use Chinese companies.
Precisely. These are almost always tied aid loans. The borrowing nation is mandated to use Chinese contractors, Chinese materials, Chinese labor, which severely inflates the project line. Cost contractor profits often run 20 to 30% higher than market rates.
So poor nations are taking on expensive, short-term, opaque debt for projects that are often built at inflated prices. And if the project fails to generate enough revenue, they crash into default.
And the consequences are severe. They often involve a loss of sovereignty or critical services. Take Sri Lanka. After defaulting on a $1.4 billion loan for the Hambantota port, they were forced into a 99-year lease of that strategic port facility to a Chinese state enterprise.
That is the textbook example of what critics call creditor imperialism.
It is. Using debt to acquire strategic, political, or economic assets.
What about the human cost in Africa, specifically Zambia?
Zambia defaulted in 2020, and critically, China delayed and often refused to participate transparently in the G20 Common Framework for Debt Restructuring. This delay put immense pressure on Zambia, forcing them to cut their medical budget by 30% just to stabilize their finances.
And poverty rates rose.
Predictably, poverty rates there subsequently rose to 54%. The cuts to critical services like health and education are the devastating, true human cost of this debt empire.
We've seen social instability, too.
Yeah, Kenya's railway project, already mired in accusations of corruption and inflated costs, led to severe budget crises and massive street protests where several people were killed.
So why? Why did China engage in such high-risk lending? Was it really just a conscious debt trap strategy from the start?
It was likely a combination of powerful dual motives. The structural outcome looks and feels exactly like a trap, regardless of the initial intent. The initial economic motive was domestic. BRI was strategically used to absorb China's massive industrial overcapacity, think millions of tons of steel, cement, surplus construction crews.
So they were exporting their internal problems.
And securing reliable resource streams and markets abroad for their own continued growth. The policy banks were profit-driven, but after the 2015 global commodity collapse, their risk assessments proved disastrously poor.
And that led to recklessness.
Which ties directly into the powerful geopolitical motive. Expanding global political influence and acquiring strategic assets in key maritime choke points, the string of pearls concept.
So they become the lender of last resort.
Exactly. They offer funds that Western institutions might reject, but they trade those funds for political allegiance, like reliable votes in the UN General Assembly. This systematically exacerbates dependency, which fuels those accusations of creditor imperialism.
And the lack of institutional coordination didn't help.
Not at all. China's lending system is fragmented. It lacks the central coordinated oversight you'd see in the World Bank, which leads to overlapping loans, opacity, and massive inefficiency.
This all raises a serious question about China's commitment to great power responsibility. They're promoting this narrative of global leadership, but their actions are undermining global stability.
It creates a massive, debilitating disconnect. China claims to pursue this high-minded community with a shared future for mankind. Yet its actions, specifically the continued delay in participating in the transparent G20 debt restructuring framework, are seen by major economies as actively undermining global financial stability.
And that instability translates directly back into human suffering.
Absolutely. Studies show that African health spending is dropped by up to 30% in highly indebted nations because of these pressures. And many DRI projects completely ignore critical ESG environmental social governance standards, which directly contradict their own statements about a green BRI.
So the result is growing anti-China sentiment.
It is. It's weakening their soft power narrative severely. The narrative of the global partner has been replaced by the image of the aggressive debt collector. The data just indicates that for many of these nations, the debt costs have far exceeded any of the benefits.
Okay, we've established that China is facing these profound economic, environmental, and geopolitical reversals, the triple headwind. Now let's look forward. What do these massive pressures mean for China's actions and its great power style in the run-up to 2026?
Geopolitically, many security analysts are now defining China not just as a rising power, but as a classic peaking power state.
What exactly defines a peaking power? Is it just that its growth rate is slowing down?
It's a bit more complex and psychological than that. A peaking power is a state that experienced a rapid, successful rise, but now faces the realization that its best days of growth are behind it. It's encountering structural speed bumps, resource constraints, and increased external resistance.
And historically, what do these states do?
Historically, they do not become benign or cooperative. They intensify their approach. They tend toward a dangerous combination of domestic suppression and aggressive, risky external expansion. They're driven by a fear of collapse or a fear that their window of opportunity for dominance is closing.
That fear-driven intensification leads us to the three most worrying actions we are seeing now. First, increased domestic repression. Some analysts are even noting what looks like the development of fascist tendencies.
Yeah, this involves intense political consolidation. We're seeing the extreme promotion of a massive cult of personality, positioning the current leader as this third pillar of power, commanding absolute, unquestioning loyalty.
And that's paired with extreme nationalism.
Aggressive, extreme nationalism, which is used to mobilize the vast population and seek retaliation against vaguely defined, existential, hostile foreign forces.
And the control mechanisms are becoming deeply technological, almost Orwellian.
Absolutely. We're talking about the development of a technologically superior surveillance state capable of mass population tracking, facial recognition, and instant automated disciplinary action. This includes the severe suppression of minority groups, where official language has described groups like the Uyghurs as a cancer that requires removal.
And we also see this total blurring of military and civilian life.
That's the military-civil fusion push. This strategy effectively eliminates the legal and practical boundary between military and civilian life, meaning any civilian organization, any university or private company can be conscripted to serve the state's military or geopolitical objectives at any time. Security and control are prioritized far above economic efficiency.
Okay, so the second worrying action is the profound shift in economic strategy, prioritizing political leverage over just generating pure growth.
Right. Since the leadership recognizes that the high-speed growth of 8% or 10% is gone forever, the strategy shifts from expansion to creating economic dominance and strategic leverage. The new focus is on dominating global economic choke points.
To gain leverage over trading partners.
Exactly, to gain critical strategic leverage over partners who rely on Chinese supply chains.
What are the best examples of these choke points in action today?
The most famous examples are control over rare earth minerals, which are essential for every high-tech product, dominating the supply of medical PPE, control over certain low-end but essential computer chips, and, critically, maintaining aggressive control over strategic sea lanes, especially in the South China Sea.
And in the shorter term, that also means massive subsidies.
Mass state subsidies for critical manufacturing sectors, like electric vehicles and solar panels, which inevitably leads to global dumping, flooding foreign markets, and creating intense pressure on their domestic producers.
And the third action ties directly back to that peaking power risk, massive, aggressive military expansion.
This is arguably the most alarming trend globally. China is undergoing what many consider the largest peacetime military buildup since Nazi Germany. They're rapidly churning out massive numbers of warships, fighter jets, and ordnance. And crucially, the actual military budget is estimated by some foreign analyses to be nearly triple the stated official figure of $230 billion.
That scale suggests a long-term aggressive posture.
We are seeing increasingly aggressive deployments, a rapid expansion in the size of their nuclear arsenal, and the maintenance of the largest forward military presence in the Taiwan Strait in a generation. Because the long-term strategy of economic integration failed to achieve unification, the military option remains highly visible and actively prepared for.
The military exercises are becoming startlingly specific, too.
They are. The sources mentioned they are building full-scale mock-ups of U.S. military bases and American aircraft carriers in the desert for live-fire training exercises. This demonstrates a clear and specific focus on projecting power against the U.S. and its allies in a potential conflict.
And this aggression is being balanced globally through alliances with other autocratic states.
This is the external balancing strategy. China is aligning closely with other revisionist states, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. This provides Russia with critical components to sustain its war effort, offers an economic lifeline to Iran and North Korea, and all the while allows China to acquire sensitive military technology like submarine silencing tech from Russia. The goal is to stretch Western resources across multiple theaters.
So let's consolidate these points into the 2026 forecast. Given all these pressures, can China realistically maintain the boast of great power status?
Economically, the official target for 2026 is around 5% GDP growth. But this target is heavily reliant on massive, continuous stimulus-projected deficits of 4% or more, significant interest rate cuts, reserve cuts, which are all necessary just to offset deflation and crippling weak domestic demand.
But the whole system is vulnerable to a black swan risk. The real estate crisis is the elephant in the room.
It is the single largest threat. Major developers are facing massive debt storms. Local government debt is astronomically high, estimated at 90 to 110 trillion RMB, with projections for another $1 trillion debt increase in 2026 alone.
So if that collapses...
If these debts collapse and trigger a banking crisis, the entire narrative shifts from an offensive boast of superiority to a desperate defensive fight for stability. It would expose the limitations of the stimulus model.
And geopolitically, what's the ceiling for tension?
U.S.-China relations are expected to maintain a kind of temporary, managed calm, a velvet reset, maybe with extensions of current trade truces. But the real danger lies in the Indo-Pacific. Analysts predict that the ongoing internal purges within the PLA might ironically encourage middle-level officers to take adventurous acts to prove loyalty.
Accidental escalation, essentially.
Yes, this could lead to accidental escalation in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea, a drone near pass, a collision between ships. The boast might continue, but the risk of crisis amplification is extremely high.
So the ultimate conclusion is illusory glory.
Exactly. China can certainly maintain the narrative and the official boast of stability and continued growth. But the combined structural issues, governance rigidity, spiking resource costs, the BRI debt wave, they form an internal skill bottleneck that limits actual strategic flexibility. Continued overconfidence risks turning the narrative of being a global engine into mere self-aggrandizement, making 2026 a genuine turning point where the world seriously questions the long-term sustainability of the miracle. The glory, at that point, becomes primarily illusory.
Wow, that was an incredibly detailed and critical look at the structural pressures Beijing is facing. We started with the economic boast, asking why the focus is always on the GDP total.
And we showed that the GDP total is the national face used purely for political superiority, while the per capita is the people's true lining, where the data shows individual affluence is significantly greater elsewhere.
We then tracked the structural reversal, the shift from the critical U.S.-aided boom in policy flexibility to the current geopolitical isolation, internal governance rigidification, and severe resource depletion.
Which has tripled the underlying cost of generating new growth. And we detailed the immense cost of that technical debt, the environmental pollution, confirming that the massive scale of untreated chemical and organic wastewater is a continuous, acute poisoning crisis.
A crisis that far exceeds the scale of regulated nuclear discharge. Finally, we analyzed the BRI, seeing how a $1 trillion vision has quickly devolved into a debt collection crisis, forcing 75 developing nations into a massive repayment peak.
And here's where it gets really interesting, the final provocative thought for you, the listener. The true measure of a great power is not winning at all costs, nor is it how much debt you can accrue. It is the capacity and willingness to lead others across the river to shared prosperity.
That's a powerful point.
China must choose between maintaining its current defensive, aggressive posturing or engaging in genuine structural reform, like fully joining the Paris Club debt framework to assist struggling nations transparently. Its choice in the next 2 years will define its global legacy far more than its total GDP figure ever will.
And we want to reiterate that this conversation is an objective analysis of facts and data. It is not criticism or discrimination against any nation or people. We encourage you, our listeners, to cultivate critical and independent thinking on all these complex global issues, look at the numbers, and question the narrative.
Absolutely. Think for yourself, look at the data, and keep digging beneath the surface.
If you enjoyed this deep dive, please encourage your friends to subscribe to Sip and Talk wherever you get your listening pleasure. And while you're at it, check out our old friend Mickey's YouTube channel, Mickeytolife, for some fun memes and travel vlogs.
We'll Sip and Talk next time.